In today's video, I'm going to be going over the best mobile photography workflow using Lightroom on the iPad Pro. So before we even get started, the first thing is going to be getting your photos onto the iPad. Now, I've been using this really great mini SD card reader from a company called Starware. I actually bought this on, let's see if you can see that here. I bought this on Amazon. I think it was like $9.99, $10. And it's been pretty reliable. I've been using it for a couple weeks now. It has a slot for an SD card and a mini SD card. It's got USB-C, so it'll plug right into the bottom of your iPad. So you can also airdrop these things to the iPad or over Wi-Fi or Bluetooth or however you can connect to the iPad via your camera or however you're shooting your photos. So once you've got the SD card in and you launch Lightroom, you'll see that all the photos immediately pop up and you can kind of scroll through the gallery and make the selects for the photos that you want to edit. Now, anyone who's been using Lightroom Mobile for any period of time knows that it's come a long way in the last couple of years. Previously, it was more of like, I think, a novelty product where you could do some basic corrections on your phone or on your iPad. And now Adobe has really elevated it to a package that is really robust and capable of doing like some pretty major edits on larger galleries of photos. So this is actually finally a practical workflow if you are shooting on paid jobs where, you know, you're doing a wedding or some kind of travel photography gig where you don't necessarily have your laptop with you at all times, but you want to do a series of selects and color correct those photos, maybe on location or something like that. So once you have the gallery open, you can go through and just kind of make those selects. For this example, I'm just going to do one photo to kind of show you the workflow. But if you go in and you just select the photo that you want, down at the bottom here, you see there's a blue import button. Go ahead and hit import and it'll bring that photo into your Lightroom gallery. We'll hit OK. So in the upper left-hand corner, you have the X, and hit that. Okay, so now you see I have the photo imported into my Lightroom album. You can create on the left-hand side here, you can create a series of albums based on your shoot, and you can organize all of your photos that way, so they're easier for you to find. So I'm gonna take you through sort of top to bottom the workflow that I normally use inside Lightroom Mobile when I'm editing any new photo. So for me, once I bring that raw photo in, and you don't necessarily need to be working on raw photos, but if you have the means to shoot raw, you're obviously going to have more color information and more to work with, which is, I think, one of the more powerful things about being able to do this on an iPad is that you can bring in your raw photos and edit them. So, you know, I bring the photo in, and the first thing I do is in the upper right-hand corner here, you'll see there's profile options. I'll switch from the default profile to Modern 4. I found that some of these modern profiles are pretty great, so going through and kind of like testing to see what they look like are good. I found 4 to be the most reliable, so I'll usually use Modern 4 as my starting point. Back out of profiles, go into the light tab. I'll increase exposure. On this particular photo, because the subject is in shadow and we're kind of shooting into the sun, I'm gonna probably go ahead and just increase the exposure a bit more than I normally would. I'll drop the highlights so I can kind of recover some of the highlights in the sky there. Increase the shadows. Increase the whites. Drop the blacks a little bit. And maybe just bump up the overall contrast. Okay, so that's a pretty decent starting point. One of the other things that I love to do is they have this little curves adjustment in the upper right-hand corner of the light dropdown. So if you click into that, you have these kind of like independent control of your red, green, and blue value, but you can also switch to kind of like the overall contrast curve. So what I like to do is go ahead and just increase the kind of like bottom black point. Same thing for the white, just to kind of like give it a more filmic look where we don't have any whites that are too blown out or any darks that are too crunchy. And then I'll go ahead and I have 3 points. So I'll add a black point, a midpoint, and something up towards the highlights. And this is where I'll kind of like start to dial in the actual contrast of the image to the place that I want it to be. And this is obviously going to differ depending on the photo that you're working on, but I'll kind of go into there. Now we're going to come back to this panel in a moment. I'm going to do the individual red, green, and blue, but for now we're just going to leave that where it's at. So next thing we're going to do is open the color tab. Now inside the color tab, you have the ability to use this little dropper here to, you can move it around and see how it affects the different white balance depending on what you're sampling. Now I shot this photo using proper daylight white balance, so I don't know that I necessarily need to do this, but sometimes I will, you know, test this out just to see how the photo changes. And if you find a white balance that you like, you just hit the little check mark in the right hand corner of the circle here. You know, you have your typical tint value adjustments, your vibrance, your saturation. I find the colors look just a little bit more natural when you drop saturation a little bit, but then you boost the vibrance. So I'll typically do something like that. Then you have your color mixer here. Now for the red, orange, and yellow color mix, I'll usually jump in there and do some minor hue adjustments to kind of make the colors pop a little bit more and kind of just make them look a little bit more stylized. This is obviously going to change depending on the subject of the photo and the vibe that you're going for. But just to benefit the skin tones, I'll usually on the red, orange, and yellow go ahead and just boost the saturation a little bit and experiment with the luminance to kind of to see the effects that I get. You can see here in the orange color mix that the effect is a little bit more drastic, and it's kind of nice because when you increase the luminance there, you get those kind of brighter orange values in the face, which is really nice. Do the same thing with the yellow. I'll probably drop the overall yellow toward kind of this red-orange look, increase the saturation, and then the same thing with the luminance. Kind of like get in there and see what these different luminance values give us. It's kind of nice when it's a little bit brighter, so I'll probably leave it somewhere around there. I don't typically change the greens, but sometimes I will go in and just kind of like see the different effects that they give. I normally go straight to the blues, and I'll drop my blues a little bit more towards cyan. I'll drop the luminance down to recover some of that sky. And then we'll probably just go ahead and leave everything else where it is. The next thing you can do is, I know previously in the app, they had this kind of color toning option that was broken out in a separate menu, and they've now created this color grading portion of the color dropdown. So inside color grading, you have the ability to apply individual grades to your blacks, your midtones, and your whites. I typically won't apply color to the midtones, so I'm going to just show you what I normally do for the black and the white. So once you have the black selected, you can kind of grab this circle here and start to move it around and see the different effects it has on the blacks. So the further you get from the center of the circle, the more extreme the color change becomes. And what you can actually do is, let's say that like you want something around that intensity, you can leave that there and then grab the color on the outside and just move it around until you get to a color hue that you like. So I typically will bring the black somewhere in the blues, so maybe somewhere around here, and then I'm going to jump over to the whites and do the same thing. The whites I'll typically give a more subtle effect because it can start to look a little wonky when the whites have a really powerful color hue applied to them. But same thing, I'll set that intensity and then I'll go and I'll dial in the hue. So I'll put that somewhere around there. So once I have the color grading and the color mix set, this is when I hop back over to the light drop down and I go into the curves adjustment, and I'll individually now edit the red, the green, and the blue adjustment sort of to either complement the color grading that I've done or to correct any strange color artifacts that I'm getting after I've done those adjustments. So beginning with the red curve, I'll start kind of in the darks, start to pull those down and see how that looks. It's introducing a bit more green, which in this case I think I do want. And I'll push the reds up in the highlights. And then I'm just going to do this all the way through red, green, and blue. And again, you're just going to adjust this to taste as you go. And in some cases, you really won't need to adjust it much at all, which is totally fine. I mean, if it looks good as is, then certainly leave it where it's at. Now, if you make any mistakes in the upper right-hand corner, you have this back button, so it's pretty easy. You see there, it just said undo change. So you can just simply back up through some of the changes that you've made along the way. So I'm just gonna go ahead and finish the curves adjustments. And that looks pretty good. And then you can just close that. One of my favorite things inside Lightroom Mobile, but they have this on the computer version as well, is this ability to kind of like toggle back and forth between the progress that you've made on the photo and where the photo began. And in this particular case, it's a pretty drastic change, right? Because we're going from this kind of like very dark image to something that's like much brighter. But it's always nice to kind of see where you've come from and how the color and exposure has changed, and that might help inform additional edits that you might want to make. So the next thing I'll do is I'm going to quickly take you through some of the tools that are here on the far right hand side. So starting at the top, you have the adjustment sliders. Then you have the presets, which if you have any presets installed, you can see them here. This will actually sync with your Lightroom Classic that you have on your computer. So if you have any preset packs that you've made yourself or that you've purchased, those will sync into this area and you can use them on your mobile photos, which is really helpful. You have, let's back out of this. You have the crop function, which will let you rotate and crop and flip the photo just as you normally would. You have the healing tool, which is really great for getting rid of small blemishes on your subject. So you can see here when you adjust the brush size, there's a red preview dot there. So once you have the brush the correct size, you can go in and just kind of paint over blemishes, and it creates this sample area. Now, sometimes when you created that sample area, it'll be on the wrong part of the photo. So what you need to do is actually grab this grab this gray diamond here and move it around. And you can see that wherever I place this now is where it's sampling from. So in most cases, it's going to automatically generate the correct sample area, but in case it doesn't, just know that you can go and grab that. And then you can continue painting additional areas if you want to kind of continue moving removing blemishes or any small marks that might be on your subject's face. Or if you were painting something out of a background, for instance, you could go in and do the same thing. If there were, if you wanted to kind of make it look like this entire driveway was covered in snow, you could slowly go through here. Well, let's go ahead and back up, make the brush bigger. We could go through here and, let's say, paint this, but then make the sample something like that. So there are a lot of different creative uses that I'm sure you can come up with for the healing brush, but that's a useful tool inside Lightroom Mobile. The next thing I'm going to show you is this masking tool. So you have the ability to, if you look, once you select the masking tool, if you click into the upper right hand corner, there should be, the upper left hand corner, there should be a plus sign. That'll give you the ability to paint a custom mask, or you can do the radial selection area. Additionally, you can just kind of do a traditional linear gradient. Now for each of these, basically the way it works is as soon as you select the one that you want to use. So in this case, let's start with the radial. Now that that's selected, you actually have to press down on the screen and kind of click and hold, and you can adjust the size. And then once you've adjusted to the size that you want, if you let go, you can use this blue dot to move the mask. And then additionally, if you wanted to rotate this, all you have to do is click and select the corner, really any corner of it, and you can go ahead and rotate that around. So, and it's the same thing for any of these. If you're doing brush selections, there's different brush sizes available here, and you can adjust the softness of the edges, and then you can just go in and kind of manually apply that brush area. And then just as in Lightroom on the computer, you can go in and make individual selective adjustments to those areas that you've masked out. So in this particular case, what I'm probably going to do is create a radial selection. Once you've made that radial selection, what you can do is just above the trash can on the left-hand side here, there's this kind of invert option, which will invert the selection that you have. And so what I typically like to do is, especially if it's a portrait, I'll do an inverted selection of the subject like this, and then I'll go in and probably darken the surrounding a little bit. So I'm kind of bringing up the shadows but dropping the exposure, just so things don't become too dark and lose their color, but that the overall exposure is reduced. So now if I click done, we can kind of see the difference between where we were and what that did for us, kind of adding that focus to the subject. The other thing I'd probably do with the selective adjustments tool in this particular case is if you look in the lower left-hand corner of the image, there's this kind of snow that's catching the sunlight and it's really blown out. If you go in and just do a sort of painted adjustment over an area like that, this is a good way to kind of like reduce that as a focal point because it does stand out so much. And yeah, I can kind of drop the whites, drop the highlights, and just reduce the overall focus of that area. So if I undo that change, you can see how much brighter it was before. And now it kind of stands out just a little bit less, which is useful. Another useful thing for the selective edits is to go in and create, you might want to do a linear gradient from one of the corners or the bottom of the frame to kind of create some natural vignetting. And you can do, you know, several of these linear gradients. Another way that you can do this inside of Lightroom Mobile is if we go into the effects controls, there is a vignetting tool in here that you can use. And in some cases, I will introduce just a little bit of vignetting into the frame using that tool as well. The other things that are useful inside the effects panel are the texture and clarity sliders. Now, for portraits, typically what you want to do is just reduce that texture slider to kind of soften the skin overall. And as you're doing this, you'll notice that the panel on the right kind of disappears. But if you look in the upper middle part of the frame, you can see the value of the texture. And so somewhere around like 30 is probably good. Kind of gives the skin an overall soft look, which is really nice. And then we can just, to kind of keep things a bit defined overall, we can just bump up the clarity by like 6 or so. So you can also go in here and you can adjust various aspects of the vignette, and you can add grain to the image, which if you are shooting at like a higher ISO, sometimes it's helpful to introduce a little bit more grain so that the photo looks natural. In this particular case, I'm just going to leave the grain at 0. So then we have the detail dropdown, which is where we have our sharpening effect. Now I'm going to zoom in again for this so that we can really see what it's doing. So if you're shooting, you know, full resolution, like 5K, 6K photos, you can get away with having I think a sharpening amount between 40 and 50 is usually good default. The radius I tend to drop to around 0.7. Anywhere between 0.5 and 1 is usually going to be good depending on the sharpness of your lens. I tend to stick to around 0.7. I'll increase the detail all the way. And then for the masking, this kind of prioritizes like edge detail, so you can increase the masking. I'll usually do it somewhere between 50 and 80. And if you do have a noisier image, you can get in and use the noise reduction tool, which is really handy. In this particular case, I don't have a ton of noise in the image, so I'm just going to leave this as is. So below detail, we have the optics menu, which this will, we have remove chromatic aberration, which is useful if you have any kind of like chromatic aberration or any other those kind of similar like lens artifacts that are being introduced in your photo. And then there's also the enable lens correction, which again, if you're shooting raw and it has the metadata, it can go in and kind of like see the distortion of the particular lens profile that you're using, or it'll just analyze the photo as is and make simple corrections based on the lens profile that you're using. This does remove vignetting from the frame, which in some cases you want to leave the vignetting. I think in this case, because we've added vignetting already, removing that vignetting does give it a little bit more of a natural look. So we'll go ahead and just leave that enabled. So the final menu is the geometry menu. This isn't super useful for things like portraits, but if you are shooting a lot of architecture or something like that and you have a lot of geometry, this will allow you to change the verticals and the horizontal lines, and you can rotate and scale and kind of correct the geometry of the frame. So that's really useful in some cases. So those are all kind of the critical tool sets inside of Lightroom Mobile. There are two just like small bonus things I'm going to show you guys that I find really useful, and you know, you might find useful for your own work. So the first one being this ability to create edit versions. And you'll see this in the kind of clock icon that's here on the right hand side. It's the very last icon at the bottom of the right hand menu. Now, when you go inside that, by default, all you'll see are the current edits and the original image. But what you can do is in the upper right hand side of the frame, you'll see there's this blue button that says create version. You can basically create a version, we'll just call this V1. And what that allows you to do is just save different edits to the photo. So if you want to experiment with different ways to stylize the same frame, this is really handy. if you're doing some kind of client work, this is maybe a good way to experiment with approaches to the color correction and kind of give them a mood board of edits of the same photo, but with different color treatments to kind of see what they find most appealing. So that's really handy for that kind of a thing. And you can go ahead and, I haven't tested to see how many versions you can save, but let's go ahead and create a few more just to see here. Version 2, version 3, version 4. So I don't know how many color options you would want to give to somebody or that you would want to try on your own photos, but 6 variations already, that's pretty good. So I'm sure that it goes well beyond that. It's probably limited to the amount of memory that you have on the device that you're using, but that is a very handy feature. So the last thing that I wanted to show you, it has to do with kind of the export function. So if you go up to the little export menu, we have the ability to, of course, export to files, export to camera roll, export as, which is the very bottom one, will give you the ability to export TIFFs or DNGs or the original file. You can select specific dimensions, include your own watermark, and all that stuff's really useful. But what I really wanted to show you is this ability to share edit, which is just above export as. So it's the second to last option here. And what's really cool about this is it essentially lets you add your edits to this kind of discovery panel that's inside Lightroom Pro. It's kind of like an Instagram gallery of inspiration, and you can see the edits that other people are posting as well as your own. So it kind of has like a social media component to it where you can find and follow some photographers that you might like, and you can actually see how they've applied their edits inside Lightroom Mobile. So in this particular case, we'll go ahead and just call this photo Big Bear. You can put a description in that kind of describes your workflow and how you approach this, but I'm just going to go ahead and leave that blank for now. You can put 3 different subject matters to kind of like help the algorithm identify what this photo is of. So we'll do people, we'll do landscape, and we'll do travel. And then you can keep this option here where it says permissions to enable to save as preset. So if someone comes along and they find this image of yours, they find these edits, and they want to basically save those changes as a preset, you can allow them to do that, and then they can just apply that to their own photos, which is kind of a fun thing. And so I'm going to go ahead and leave that enabled. I'll hit the check mark. And now this is going to basically compile a short time lapse of the changes that you've made inside Lightroom Mobile. And so then you can basically watch this time lapse that starts from the moment you import the photo all the way through to the final result. Now the time-lapsed version of the edits that you've made, it is compressed, like it's not really using the full quality image, which does bother me a little bit, but it's still a really interesting thing to see. And if we go back here to the main menu, there's this little globe in the upper left-hand corner. If you click on that globe, this is where you get this kind of gallery that you can scroll through and see the edits that other people have made. And even in this gallery view, if you were to just click and hold, you can actually see the difference between where that person started and where the edit ended. And if you see a particular photo that you really like, and you want to watch the editing process of that photo, you can click on the photo itself, and then you'll be able to actually see that time lapse. So that's a fun thing that I think it makes the whole photography experience a little more interesting, gives you some inspiration and some motivation to kind of keep improving as you're shooting your photos. So that's the end of today's video. I hope that you guys found some of those tips useful. If you did, let me know by leaving a comment below and giving the video a thumbs up. If you haven't subscribed to the channel, go ahead and do that, and you'll get notifications anytime I post new content. So until next time, I'll see you guys later.